The crisp morning air at Edwards Air Force Base carried the distinctive whine of jet engines as Colonel Sarah Mitchell adjusted her flight suit and watched another group of civilian volunteers shuffle through the base's main gate. Community outreach. Days were mandatory but tedious, filled with retired veterans trying to relive their glory days and aviation enthusiasts who thought watching Top Gun made them experts. What she didn't expect was the quiet woman in sensible walking shoes who would challenge everything the Air Force thought it knew about excellence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun had barely crested the mountains surrounding Edwards Air Force Base when Dorothy Chen stepped off the shuttle bus, her weathered hands gripping a small canvas bag that had seen better decades. At 71, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to conserve energy for the things that truly mattered. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore a faded denim jacket over khaki pants that suggested comfort over fashion. To the casual observer, she looked like every other volunteer who showed up for the base's monthly community appreciation program. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez barely glanced up from his clipboard as Dorothy approached the registration table. The morning routine was always the same. Check names against the approved visitor list, hand out security badges, and direct the civilians toward the designated tour areas. Most volunteers were either military retirees seeking nostalgia or local residents curious about the taxpayer-funded aircraft that thundered over their neighborhoods daily. Name? Rodriguez asked without looking up, his pen poised over the visitor log. Dorothy Chen, she replied quietly, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested English wasn't her first language, though she spoke it with perfect precision. Rodriguez scanned his list, found her name, and mechanically handed over a bright orange visitor badge. "Welcome to Edwards, ma'am. Please wear this at all times and stay with your assigned group. Today's program includes a briefing on base operations, a tour of the flight line, and a demonstration of our F-35 Lightning II capabilities." Dorothy clipped the badge to her jacket and studied the base layout map Rodriguez had provided. Her eyes moved across the airfield with systematic attention, noting runway configurations, hangar placements, and the positioning of various aircraft scattered across the tarmac. To Rodriguez, she appeared to be another curious civilian trying to make sense of military organization. He had no way of knowing that Dorothy was mentally cataloging details with the precision of someone who had spent decades understanding how airbases functioned. The volunteer group assembled near the base operations building was typical of such gatherings. Retired Air Force Master Sergeant William Thompson proudly wore his veteran cap adorned with squadron patches, eager to share stories with anyone who would listen. Local business owner Patricia Valdez had brought her teenage son Jake, hoping to inspire his interest in military service. Teacher Robert Kim was taking notes for his aerospace engineering class, while retired insurance agent Helen Foster seemed more interested in the social aspects of the outing than the technical details. Dorothy positioned herself toward the back of the group, a habit developed over years of preferring observation to attention. She watched as base personnel prepared for another routine community relations exercise, noting the subtle signs of resignation in their expressions. These events were clearly viewed as necessary obligations rather than meaningful opportunities. Captain Jennifer Walsh emerged from the operations building with the polished enthusiasm of someone well-practiced in public relations. Her flight suit was crisp, her bearing confident, and her smile professionally warm. At 32, she represented the new generation of Air Force officers, technically proficient, media-savvy, and comfortable explaining complex military capabilities to civilian audiences. "Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Edwards Air Force Base," Captain Walsh announced, her voice carrying easily across the small group. My name is Captain Jennifer Walsh, and I'll be your guide today. We're going to show you some of the most advanced aircraft in the world and explain how we maintain America's air superiority through constant innovation and training. The group responded with polite murmurs of appreciation and interest. Master. Sergeant Thompson nodded approvingly, while Patricia Valdez nudged her son to pay attention. Dorothy remained silent, her attention focused not on the captain's words, but on the aircraft visible in the distance and the activity patterns of personnel moving across the flight line. Captain Walsh continued her opening remarks with practiced efficiency. Edwards Air Force Base has been the center of flight testing for over 70 years. Every major American military aircraft has been tested here, from the first jets to our current fifth-generation fighters. Today, you'll get to see the F-35 Lightning II, the most advanced multi-role fighter in the world. As the group began, moving toward the first stop on their tour, Dorothy noticed details that escaped the other volunteers' attention. The way maintenance crews positioned themselves around various aircraft, the communication protocols between ground personnel, the subtle timing of operations that kept multiple activities flowing smoothly across the vast airfield. Her observations were systematic and professional, though she kept her insights to herself. The first official stop was the Base Museum, housed in a hangar filled with historic aircraft that told the story of American aviation development. Captain Walsh led the group past displays of experimental jets, rocket-powered aircraft, and the various prototypes that had pushed the boundaries of flight performance over the decades. "This is the X-1, Captain Walsh explained, gesturing toward the orange rocket plane that had broken the sound barrier. Chuck Yeager first achieved supersonic flight in this aircraft in 1947, right here at Edwards. It represented a breakthrough that changed aviation forever." Master Sergeant Thompson stepped forward eagerly. "I remember reading about that flight when I was a kid. Yeager was a real pilot's pilot, someone who understood that pushing boundaries required both skill and courage." "Absolutely," Captain Walsh agreed. "The test pilot tradition at Edwards continues today with our current programs. We're still pushing boundaries, just with more advanced technology and safety protocols." Dorothy studied the X-1 with quiet intensity, her eyes moving across the aircraft's configuration with the systematic attention of someone who understood aerodynamic principles. She noted the rocket engine placement, the wing design characteristics, and the control surface arrangements that had made supersonic flight possible. When Master Sergeant Thompson asked about the aircraft's performance specifications, Dorothy's lips moved silently as she performed mental calculations based on the visible design elements. The group moved through the museum's chronological displays, from early jets through the various experimental aircraft that had tested new technologies and flight regimes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Captain Walsh provided competent explanations of each aircraft's significance, but her commentary remained at the level appropriate for general audiences rather than technical discussions. As they approached a display featuring the F-104 Starfighter, Dorothy paused longer than the other visitors. The sleek interceptor had been controversial during its service life, praised for its performance, but criticized for its demanding flight characteristics. She studied the aircraft's radical design with evident familiarity, as if remembering specific details about its handling qualities. The F-104 was known as the missile with a man in it, Captain Walsh explained. It could fly faster and higher than almost anything else in its era, but it required exceptional pilot skill to operate safely. The accident rate was higher than we would accept today. Teacher Robert Kim raised his hand with a question. What made it so difficult to fly? Was it just the high performance, or were there specific design characteristics that created problems? Captain Walsh provided a textbook answer about wing loading, power-to-weight ratios, and the challenges of early jet engine technology. Her explanation was accurate but generic, covering the information that would be found in any aviation textbook or Wikipedia article. Dorothy continued studying the F-104 while listening to the captain's explanation. Her expression suggested she was comparing the official account with some other source of knowledge, though she offered no comments or corrections to the discussion. When the group moved on to the next display, she lingered briefly, her hand almost reaching toward the aircraft before she caught herself and rejoined the others. The museum tour concluded at a display dedicated to current operations, featuring models and information panels about the F-35 program. Captain Walsh's presentation became more animated as she described the Lightning II's capabilities and the base's role in testing and evaluation. The F-35 represents the culmination of decades of advancement in stealth technology, sensor integration, and multi-role capability, she explained. It's not just a fighter aircraft. It's a flying computer that can perform air-to-air combat, ground attack, and reconnaissance missions with equal effectiveness. Patricia Valdez asked about the cost and complexity of the program, prompting Captain Walsh to provide the standard public affairs responses about value, capability, and international partnerships. Master Sergeant Thompson inquired about how current pilots compared to previous generations, leading to diplomatic comments about improved training and technology. Throughout these exchanges, Dorothy remained silent but attentive. Her questions would have been more penetrating than those asked by the other volunteers, but she seemed content to listen and observe rather than reveal the depth of her interest or knowledge. As the group prepared to leave the museum for the Flightline tour, Dorothy made a brief stop at the gift shop. She purchased a small Edwards Air Force Base patch and a technical manual about flight testing procedures, items that suggested more than casual interest in the base's mission. The cashier, Airman First Class Lisa Park, barely registered the elderly woman's purchases among the day's routine transactions. The walk to the Flightline took the group past various base facilities that Captain Walsh identified with brief explanations. The fire station, the control tower, the maintenance hangars, and the specialized buildings that supported flight test operations. Dorothy absorbed these details while maintaining her position at the back of the group, occasionally glancing at her purchased manual and comparing printed information with observable reality. The Flightline itself was impressive even to civilian eyes. Multiple aircraft were positioned across the tarmac, from conventional fighters to experimental prototypes that pushed the boundaries of current technology. The scale of operations was vast, with hundreds of personnel managing the complex choreography required to keep advanced aircraft flying safely and effectively. Captain Walsh led the group to a designated viewing area, where they could observe flight operations without interfering with normal activities. The location provided excellent visibility of the primary runway and the various aircraft preparation areas where crews readied jets for their missions. "What you're seeing here represents the cutting edge of American air power," Captain Walsh announced. "Every aircraft on this flight line incorporates technology that didn't exist even a decade ago. Our pilots train constantly to master these systems and maintain the superiority that keeps our nation secure." The group watched as an F-22 Raptor taxied past their position, its angular stealth configuration drawing appreciative comments from several volunteers. The pilot's helmet was visible through the canopy, and Captain Walsh explained the advanced displays and controls that modern aviators use to manage their aircraft's capabilities. Dorothy studied the F-22 with particular attention, her eyes tracking the aircraft's movement and noting details about its configuration that escaped the other observers. When Master Sergeant Thompson commented on the plane's impressive appearance, she nodded slightly but offered no verbal response to his enthusiasm. The morning's activities continued with demonstrations of ground support equipment and explanations. of the various specialties required to maintain combat readiness. Maintenance crews showed how they serviced aircraft engines. Weapons specialists explained ordnance handling procedures, and communications technicians demonstrated the systems that coordinated complex flight operations. Each presentation was professionally delivered and appropriately scaled for civilian audiences. The base personnel were competent and courteous, answering questions within the bounds of what could be shared publicly while maintaining the security requirements that governed sensitive information. Dorothy absorbed every detail of these presentations, though her questions remained unasked. She watched maintenance procedures with evident understanding, studied weapons handling with professional interest, and observed communication protocols with the attention of someone who appreciated their complexity and importance. As the lunch break approached, the volunteers were directed to the base dining facility where they would eat alongside active duty personnel. The arrangement was intended to provide authentic experiences and informal opportunities for civilians to interact with service members in a relaxed setting. Dorothy selected a simple meal and found a seat at a partially occupied table, where several young airmen were discussing their morning training activities. She listened to their conversation. While eating quietly, learning about their specialties, their challenges, and their perspectives on military service. Airman Jake Morrison was complaining about the complexity of F-35 maintenance procedures, noting that the aircraft required extensive computer diagnostics for problems that experienced mechanics could have identified quickly on older jets. His frustration was evident as he described systems that seemed designed more for theoretical perfection than practical efficiency. "Everything has to go through the computer," Morrison said, between bites of his sandwich. "You can't just look at the engine and know what's wrong. You have to plug in the diagnostic equipment, run through a dozen software checks, and wait for the system to tell you what any decent mechanic already knows." Senior Airman Maria Santos offered a different perspective, arguing that the integrated systems provided capabilities that justified their complexity. "The diagnostics catch problems before they become failures," she pointed out. "Yes, it's more complicated, but it's also more reliable and more capable than anything we've had before." Dorothy listened to this exchange with obvious interest, though she offered no comments to the discussion. Her attention seemed focused on understanding how current personnel viewed their equipment and their challenges rather than sharing her own perspectives on aviation technology. The conversation shifted to training requirements and the demands placed on modern aircrew. Airman Morrison noted that pilots seemed increasingly dependent on automated systems and computer assistance, suggesting that fundamental flying skills might be deteriorating in favor of systems management capabilities. "I've heard some of the older instructors say that pilots today are more like computer operators than real aviators," Morrison said. "Everything is so automated that they're not learning to actually fly the aircraft. They're learning to manage the computers that fly the aircraft." Senior Airman Santos disagreed, arguing that modern aircraft capabilities require different skills rather than diminished skills. "Flying a fifth-generation fighter isn't easier than flying older jets," she maintained. "It's different, and it requires mastering systems that didn't exist when those older instructors were learning to fly." This debate clearly interested Dorothy, who leaned forward slightly to hear the discussion more clearly. Her expression suggested she had strong opinions about the balance between human skills and automated systems, though she maintained her silence even when directly asked by Senior Airman Santos whether she had thoughts about aviation technology. "I'm just here to learn," Dorothy replied politely when pressed for her perspective. "You young people understand these modern systems much better than I could." The response was diplomatically humble, but something in Dorothy's tone suggested there was more to her knowledge than she was revealing. Senior Airman Santos seemed to sense this depth, but the conversation moved on to other topics before she could pursue her intuition about the quiet elderly volunteer. Lunch concluded with Captain Walsh gathering the group for the afternoon's main event, a detailed presentation about the F-35 program, followed by an actual flight demonstration. This was the portion of the tour that generated the most excitement. Among the volunteers, as few civilians ever got to see advanced military aircraft perform in person. The group assembled in a briefing room where Major David Chen, the base's F-35 program liaison, prepared to deliver a comprehensive overview of the Lightning II's capabilities and significance. Major Chen was an experienced pilot who had transitioned from conventional fighters to the F-35 program, bringing both operational experience and technical expertise to his current assignment. The F-35 Lightning II represents a quantum leap in combat aircraft capability, Major Chen began, using a presentation filled with impressive statistics and technical specifications. This isn't just an evolution of previous fighter designs. It's a completely new approach to air combat that integrates stealth, sensors, and connectivity in ways that transform how we think about air warfare. The presentation covered the aircraft's development history, its 3 variants designed for different service branches and mission requirements, and the international partnerships that had made the program possible. Major Chen explained how the F-35's advanced sensors could detect threats at unprecedented ranges while remaining invisible to enemy radar systems. Master Sergeant Thompson asked several technical questions about performance specifications and combat capabilities, receiving detailed but appropriately general responses that satisfied his curiosity without revealing classified information. Teacher Robert Kim inquired about the training requirements for F-35 pilots, learning about the extensive simulation and classroom instruction that preceded actual flight training. Dorothy listened to the entire presentation with focused attention, occasionally taking notes in a small notebook she had retrieved from her canvas bag. Her questions remained unasked, but her engagement with the material was obvious to anyone paying attention to her reactions and note-taking activity. When Major Chen described the aircraft's fly-by-wire flight control systems and the computer assistance that helped pilots manage the F-35's complex capabilities, Dorothy's note-taking became more intensive. She seemed particularly interested in the balance between automated systems and pilot input, filling several pages with observations that would have surprised anyone who assumed she was just another curious civilian. The briefing concluded with Major Chen announcing that the afternoon would feature an actual F-35 demonstration flight, allowing the volunteers to see the aircraft's capabilities firsthand. Captain Lisa Rodriguez will be flying today's demonstration, he explained. She's one of our most experienced F-35 pilots, and will show you maneuvers that highlight the aircraft's unique performance characteristics. As the group prepared to move outside for the flight demonstration, Dorothy approached Major Chen with a polite question about the technical manual she had purchased earlier. She wanted to know whether the flight testing procedures described in the book were still current, or whether newer methods had replaced the documented approaches. Major Chen glanced at the manual and recognized it as an older publication that covered general flight testing principles rather than current specific procedures. The basic concepts in that book are still valid, he explained, but our current methods are much more sophisticated and computer-assisted than what's described there. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully and thanked him for the clarification. Her question had been knowledgeable enough to suggest genuine understanding of flight testing principles, but Major Chen was too busy preparing for the demonstration to give much thought to why an elderly volunteer would be interested in such technical details. The group assembled at the designated viewing area just as Captain Rodriguez was completing her pre-flight checks in the F-35. The aircraft sat on the ramp like a technological sculpture, its angular stealth configuration and advanced systems representing the pinnacle of current fighter design. Captain Walsh provided commentary as Captain Rodriguez started the engine and began her taxi toward the runway. What you're seeing is approximately $90 million worth of the most advanced technology ever put into a fighter aircraft. The F-35's computer systems process more information per second than most people encounter in their entire careers. The volunteers watched with obvious fascination as the Lightning II moved toward its takeoff position. Dorothy's attention was particularly focused, her notebook ready for observations, as she prepared to witness capabilities that few civilians ever saw demonstrated. Master Sergeant Thompson expressed amazement at the aircraft's quiet operation compared to the older jets he remembered from his service years. The engines on F-4 Phantoms would shake the ground when they spooled up, he noted. This thing sounds almost civilized by comparison. Captain Walsh explained that noise reduction was one of many improvements incorporated into modern fighter design, along with enhanced efficiency, reduced maintenance requirements, and improved pilot comfort. During long missions, the F-35 represented decades of advancement in every aspect of combat aircraft development. As Captain Rodriguez received clearance for takeoff, Dorothy positioned herself for the best possible view of the demonstration. Her notebook was open, her pen ready, and her attention completely focused on the aircraft that was about to display capabilities that would challenge everything the Air Force thought it knew about flying excellence. The demonstration was about to begin, and Dorothy Chen was about to remind everyone that assumptions about age, appearance, and capability could be dangerously misleading. What happened next would transform a routine community relations event into a revelation that shook the very foundations of military aviation training and evaluation. The F-35 Lightning II accelerated down the runway with the smooth power that characterized modern fighter aircraft, its advanced engine systems providing thrust that seemed almost effortless compared to the dramatic displays of older jets. Captain Rodriguez lifted off cleanly and began climbing toward the altitude where she would demonstrate the aircraft's capabilities for the assembled volunteers. Dorothy watched the initial phase of the flight with systematic attention, her pen moving across her notebook as she recorded observations that reflected deeper understanding than her elderly civilian appearance would suggest. The other volunteers were content to marvel at the spectacle, but Dorothy was analyzing performance characteristics with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing. Captain Rodriguez began her demonstration with basic maneuvers designed to showcase the F-35's stability and control responsiveness. She performed gentle turns, climbs, and descents that highlighted the aircraft's smooth handling characteristics and the integration between pilot inputs and computer-assisted flight controls. What you're seeing is the result of fly-by-wire technology that makes the F-35 much easier to fly than previous generation fighters, Captain Walsh explained to the group. The computer systems help the pilot manage the aircraft and prevent dangerous flight conditions that could lead to accidents. Master Sergeant Thompson nodded appreciatively while watching the graceful maneuvers. It looks almost easy compared to the wild flying we used to see at air shows. Much more controlled and predictable. Dorothy's pen continued moving across her notebook, but her observations were focusing on details that escaped the other spectators. She was noting the aircraft's energy management during maneuvers, the timing of control inputs relative to aircraft responses, and the integration between different flight control systems that created the smooth performance everyone was admiring. Captain Rodriguez progressed to more aggressive demonstrations, showing the F-35's ability to perform high G-turns, rapid climbs, and the kind of maneuvering that would be required during combat operations. The aircraft's performance was impressive, showcasing capabilities that represented significant advancement over previous fighter designs. As the demonstration continued, Dorothy's note-taking became more intensive. She seemed to be recording specific details about aircraft performance that went far beyond what a casual observer would notice or understand. Her observations suggested familiarity with flight characteristics and performance, analysis that wouldn't be expected from someone attending a civilian tour. The climax of Captain Rodriguez's demonstration was a series of advanced maneuvers that highlighted the F-35's unique capabilities. She performed vertical climbs that showcased the aircraft's thrust-to-weight ratio, high-speed passes that demonstrated its aerodynamic efficiency, and complex turning sequences that revealed the integration between stealth configuration and flight performance. Dorothy's attention during these advanced maneuvers was absolutely focused, her notebook filled with observations and calculations that reflected sophisticated understanding of what she was witnessing. When Captain Rodriguez performed a particularly complex sequence of rolls and turns, Dorothy's pen moved with the confidence of someone who could predict and analyze each phase of the demonstration. The flight demonstration concluded with Captain Rodriguez performing a series of approaches and go-arounds that showed the F-35's landing characteristics and the precision possible with modern flight control systems. Each approach was perfectly executed, demonstrating the consistency and predictability that made the Lightning II effective for pilots with varying experience levels. As Captain Rodriguez taxied back toward the ramp, the volunteers expressed their appreciation for the impressive display they had witnessed. Master Sergeant Thompson was particularly enthusiastic, comparing the F-35's capabilities to the aircraft he had worked with during his military service. "That was incredible," Patricia Valdez told her son Jake. "I had no idea our military aircraft were so advanced." Captain Rodriguez made it look almost effortless. Dorothy closed her notebook and prepared to rejoin the group for the final portion of their tour, but her expression suggested she had observed things during the demonstration that others had missed. Her analysis of Captain Rodriguez's flying had been systematic and professional, recorded with the precision of someone who understood exactly what constituted excellent piloting technique. Captain Walsh gathered the volunteers for the concluding portion of their visit, which would include an opportunity to see the F-35 up close and ask questions of the ground crew responsible for maintaining such complex aircraft. This final segment was designed to provide intimate contact with the technology and personnel that made advanced military aviation possible. As they approached the aircraft, Dorothy's pace slowed slightly and her attention became even more focused than it had been throughout the day. The opportunity to examine the F-35 closely was clearly significant to her, though she maintained the same quiet demeanor that had characterized her behavior since arriving at Edwards that morning. The ground crew gathered around the aircraft was typical of modern Air Force maintenance specialists, young, technically trained, and confident in their expertise. Staff Sergeant Michelle Torres, the crew chief responsible for this particular F-35, prepared to answer questions about the aircraft's systems and maintenance requirements. "This aircraft represents the most advanced technology in our inventory," Staff Sergeant Torres announced to the group. "Every system is computer monitored and computer controlled. We can diagnose problems and predict maintenance requirements with precision that wasn't possible with older aircraft." Teacher Robert Kim asked about the complexity of maintenance procedures, receiving a detailed explanation of the extensive training required for F-35 technicians and the sophisticated equipment used to service the aircraft's various systems. Dorothy listened to these explanations while studying the aircraft's configuration with obvious fascination. Her eyes moved across the F-35 surfaces with systematic attention, noting details about construction, system integration, and design. Characteristics that reflected deep understanding of aircraft engineering principles. When Master Sergeant Thompson asked about pilot training requirements, Staff Sergeant Torres explained the extensive simulation and classroom instruction that preceded actual flight training in the F-35. "The aircraft is so complex that pilots spend months learning systems management before they ever get in the cockpit," she noted. "Modern pilots have to be computer experts as much as aviators," added Senior Airman Carlos Mendez, who specialized in the F-35's electronic systems. The aircraft's capabilities are so advanced that managing them requires understanding computer interfaces and data integration that didn't exist in previous generations of fighters. Dorothy's notebook appeared again as she recorded observations about the discussion and the aircraft itself. Her notes seemed to focus on the balance between human skills and automated systems, a topic that had interested her during the lunch conversation and was proving central to understanding modern military aviation. As the formal presentations concluded, the volunteers were given time to examine the aircraft more closely and ask individual questions of the various specialists. Dorothy approached Staff Sergeant Torres with inquiries about specific technical aspects of F-35 operations that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what would be expected from a civilian volunteer. "I noticed the flight control surfaces are much smaller than on older fighters," Dorothy observed. "How does the fly-by-wire system compensate for the reduced control authority during extreme maneuvering?" Staff Sergeant Torres looked surprised at the technical sophistication of the question. Most civilian inquiries focused on basic capabilities or general performance characteristics, rather than specific engineering details about control system integration. The computer systems provide augmentation that makes the small control surfaces effective even in extreme conditions, Torres replied, though her response was somewhat uncertain. The question had revealed knowledge that suggested professional rather than casual interest in aircraft design principles. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully and asked a follow-up question about the integration between the F-35 stealth configuration and its aerodynamic performance. "I'm curious about how the angular surfaces required for radar reduction affect airflow management at high angles of attack." This second question confirmed that Dorothy's knowledge went far beyond what any civilian tour participant should possess. Staff Sergeant Torres found herself struggling to provide adequate answers to inquiries that reflected sophisticated understanding of both stealth technology and aerodynamic engineering. "Ma'am, those are pretty technical questions," Torres finally admitted. "I'm not sure I can give you the kind of detailed answers you're looking for. Are you an engineer or something?" Dorothy smiled politely and deflected the question with characteristic humility. "I'm just curious about how technology has advanced. Thank you for taking the time to explain things to me." But Staff Sergeant Torres wasn't satisfied with the evasive response. Dorothy's questions had demonstrated knowledge that couldn't be explained by casual curiosity or general reading about aviation topics. Her inquiries reflected understanding of specific technical principles that required professional training or extensive practical experience. As the tour concluded and the volunteers prepared to depart, Staff Sergeant Torres mentioned Dorothy's unusual questions to Senior Airman Mendez. "That elderly lady was asking about things that most of our pilots don't fully understand," she noted. "Her questions were more sophisticated than what we get from engineering students or aviation journalists." Senior Airman Mendez had also noticed Dorothy's intensive note-taking and systematic observation throughout the demonstration. "She was recording details about the flight performance that I wouldn't have thought to document," he agreed. Her focus was professional, like she was conducting some kind of evaluation. Their conversation was overheard by Captain Walsh, who had been managing the day's activities with professional competence but routine attention. The suggestion that one of her civilian volunteers possessed unusual expertise was intriguing, enough to warrant closer examination. "What kind of questions was she asking?" Captain Walsh inquired, approaching the maintenance specialists with growing curiosity about the elderly volunteer, who had seemed so unremarkable throughout most of the day's activities. Staff Sergeant Torres described Dorothy's technical inquiries about flight control systems and stealth integration, questions that reflected understanding far beyond what civilian tour participants typically possessed. She was asking the kind of questions we get from test pilots or aeronautical engineers, not from retired civilians on community appreciation visits. Captain Walsh's interest was now fully engaged. She had conducted dozens of these civilian tours, and participants typically asked about speed, weapons capabilities, and cost rather than sophisticated technical details about aerodynamic engineering and systems integration. Did she mention any background in aviation or engineering? Captain Walsh asked, though she already suspected the answer would be negative. Based on Dorothy's consistent deflection of personal questions throughout the day, she avoided talking about herself. Senior Airman Mendez confirmed. But her knowledge was obvious from the questions she asked and the way she observed everything. She was taking notes like someone conducting a professional evaluation rather than enjoying a recreational tour. As the volunteers prepared to board their departure shuttle, Captain Walsh approached Dorothy with growing curiosity about the elderly woman who had demonstrated such sophisticated understanding of advanced aviation technology. "Mrs. Chen, I hope you enjoyed today's program," Captain Walsh said, opening a conversation that she hoped would reveal more about Dorothy's background and the source of her evident expertise. "It was very educational," Dorothy replied politely. "Thank you for taking the time to show us such impressive capabilities." Captain Walsh pressed gently for more information. "Some of our maintenance specialists mentioned that you asked very technical questions about the F-35's design and performance. Do you have a background in aviation or engineering?" Dorothy's response was characteristically modest and evasive. "I've always been interested in how things fly. Modern aircraft are so much more advanced than anything I've seen before." The answer revealed nothing about Dorothy's background while confirming her sophisticated interest in aviation technology. Captain Walsh sensed there was much more to learn about the quiet volunteer, but time constraints and social conventions prevented more aggressive inquiry. As Dorothy boarded the shuttle for departure, she offered polite thanks for the day's activities and expressed appreciation for the personnel who had shared their time and expertise. Her demeanor remained humble and grateful, giving no indication of the extraordinary capabilities that would soon transform everyone's understanding of what was possible. But Captain Walsh continued watching Dorothy through the shuttle window. As the vehicle departed Edwards Air Force Base, her intuition telling her that today's seemingly routine community relations event had introduced her to someone whose presence represented far more than anyone had realized. The shuttle disappeared toward the base's main gate, carrying Dorothy Chen back to whatever life awaited her beyond the boundaries of military aviation. What none of the Air Force personnel could have imagined was that their quiet elderly volunteer would return within weeks under circumstances that would challenge every assumption they had made about age, capability, and the nature of flying excellence. Dorothy's notebook contained observations and insights that would soon prove invaluable, and her questions had revealed knowledge that couldn't be dismissed as casual curiosity. The stage was set for a confrontation between institutional assumptions and individual capability that would transform how the Air Force understood the relationship between experience, expertise, and the ability to push the boundaries of what was possible in military aviation. The Community Appreciation Day had concluded with apparent success, but for Dorothy Chen, it had been reconnaissance for something far more significant. The elderly volunteer who had seemed so unremarkable was about to demonstrate that excellence came in unexpected packages, and that the Air Force's most advanced aircraft might not be as challenging as its pilots and maintainers assumed. 3 weeks after Dorothy Chen's visit to Edwards Air Force Base, an unexpected phone call would set in motion events that no one could have anticipated. The call came to the base public affairs office on a Tuesday morning, when Captain Jennifer Walsh was reviewing applications for the upcoming annual airshow demonstration team selection process. "Captain Walsh, this is Colonel Patricia Hartwell. From Pentagon Personnel Review," the voice on the other end announced with official authority. "I'm calling regarding a civilian volunteer who recently participated in one of your community outreach programs. We need to discuss Dorothy Chen and some unusual inquiries that have reached our attention. Captain Walsh immediately recalled the elderly volunteer whose technical questions had puzzled her maintenance specialists. Yes, ma'am, Mrs. Chen participated in our program 3 weeks ago. Is there some kind of security concern? Not a security concern exactly, Colonel Hartwell replied carefully. But we've received some interesting correspondence that suggests Mrs. Chen's background might be more complex than your initial screening indicated. Would it be possible for you to arrange another meeting with her? The conversation that followed was cryptic but intriguing. Colonel Hartwell couldn't provide detailed information over an unsecured line, but she strongly suggested that Dorothy Chen warranted more attention than a typical civilian volunteer. The Pentagon's interest in an elderly community outreach participant was unusual enough to command Captain Walsh's immediate cooperation. Within 48 hours, Dorothy received a polite invitation to return to Edwards Air Force Base for what was described as a follow-up consultation regarding technical observations made during her recent visit. The invitation was professionally worded but sufficiently vague to avoid revealing the growing institutional curiosity about her background and capabilities. Dorothy's response was characteristically modest. She would be happy to return if her observations could be helpful, though she couldn't imagine what insights a civilian volunteer might offer to professional military aviators. Her humble tone masked a deeper understanding of why the Air Force might be reconsidering their initial assessment of her knowledge and experience. The second visit was scheduled for a Thursday morning with a much smaller group than the typical community outreach programs. Only Dorothy and 3 base personnel would participate: Captain Walsh, Major David Chun from the F-35 Program Office, and Chief Master Sergeant Robert Kowalski, the base's senior enlisted advisor for flight operations. Dorothy arrived wearing the same practical clothing that had characterized her first visit, carrying the same canvas bag and maintaining the same unassuming demeanor that had initially led everyone to dismiss her as just another curious retiree. Her appearance provided no hint of the capabilities that would soon challenge fundamental assumptions about age, expertise, and flying excellence. The meeting began in a conference room where Major Chun presented a more detailed briefing about F-35 capabilities and current operational challenges. Unlike the previous public presentation designed for general audiences, this briefing included technical information about performance limitations, training difficulties, and the ongoing efforts to optimize the aircraft's complex systems. We're constantly working to improve pilot proficiency and reduce the extensive training time required for F-35 qualification, Major Chun explained. The aircraft's capabilities are extraordinary, but mastering them requires months of intensive instruction that pushes our training resources to their limits. Dorothy listened attentively while taking notes in the same small notebook she had used during her first visit. Her questions during this more technical presentation revealed even deeper knowledge than she had demonstrated previously, focusing on specific aspects of flight control integration and pilot workload management that surprised her military audience. I'm curious about the relationship between the aircraft's automated systems and fundamental piloting skills, Dorothy observed. Are pilots learning to fly the F-35, or are they learning to manage computers that fly the F-35? The question struck at the heart of ongoing debates within the Air Force about modern pilot training and the balance between technological assistance and basic aviation skills. Major Chun's response revealed that this was indeed a significant concern among instructors and senior pilots. That's actually one of our biggest challenges, Major Chun admitted. The F-35 systems are so sophisticated that pilots can become dependent on automation and lose proficiency in fundamental flying skills that become critical when systems fail or conditions exceed normal parameters. Chief Master Sergeant Kowalski elaborated on the training implications of this challenge. We're seeing young pilots who can manage the F-35 systems effectively in normal conditions, but struggle when they have to actually fly the aircraft manually during emergencies or equipment failures. Dorothy's follow-up questions demonstrated understanding of pilot training principles that went far beyond casual knowledge. She inquired about specific instructional techniques, training progression methods, and evaluation criteria that revealed familiarity with aviation education at a professional level. Have you considered incorporating more fundamental flight training before introducing pilots to the F-35's automated systems? Dorothy asked. Building strong basic skills first might create better foundation for managing complex technology. Later, the suggestion was reasonable and reflected understanding of educational principles that career military instructors would appreciate. But coming from an elderly civilian volunteer, it carried implications that made the Air Force personnel increasingly curious about Dorothy's background and experience. Captain Walsh decided to probe more directly. Mrs. Chen, your questions suggest considerable familiarity with pilot training methods. Do you have experience in aviation education or flight instruction? Dorothy's response maintained her characteristic humility while deflecting specific inquiry about her background. I've always been interested in how people learn complex skills. Flying seems like it would require balancing many different types of knowledge and abilities. The answer was diplomatically evasive but accurate, revealing Dorothy's sophistication without providing specific information about her qualifications or experience. Her ability to discuss complex topics while avoiding personal details was becoming increasingly notable to her military audience. Major Chen shifted the conversation toward more technical aspects of F-35 performance, presenting data about the aircraft's capabilities in various flight regimes and operational scenarios. Dorothy's analysis of this information was systematic and professional, identifying patterns and relationships that reflected advanced understanding of aircraft performance characteristics. The thrust-to-weight ratio data suggests the aircraft should be capable of significantly better climb performance than what your pilots are achieving operationally, Dorothy observed after studying the presented specifications. Are there system limitations or pilot technique factors that account for the difference between theoretical and actual performance? The observation was astute and accurate. Operational F-35 performance was indeed falling short of theoretical capabilities in several areas, primarily due to pilot technique and training limitations, rather than aircraft design problems. Dorothy's ability to identify this discrepancy from basic performance data impressed her military audience. Chief Master Sergeant Kowalski acknowledged the accuracy of Dorothy's assessment. You're absolutely right. Our pilots aren't extracting the full performance potential from the aircraft, primarily because they're not comfortable pushing the F-35 to its limits during normal operations. Why not? Dorothy asked, her question carrying the directness of someone genuinely curious about operational limitations, rather than someone making casual conversation. The answer revealed significant concerns about pilot confidence and training effectiveness. Many F-35 pilots were hesitant to fully utilize the aircraft's capabilities because they didn't completely understand or trust the complex systems that made such performance possible. Modern pilots are used to having computer assistance for everything, Major Chen explained. When they have to push beyond normal parameters, they're not confident in their ability to maintain control if the automation fails or provides unexpected responses. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully while making additional notes. Her questions continued to focus on the fundamental relationship between pilot skills and aircraft capabilities, suggesting she understood that technology was only as effective as the human operators who employed it. As the morning discussion continued, Dorothy's observations became increasingly sophisticated and her questions more penetrating. She inquired about specific training scenarios, evaluation methods, and performance. Standards that revealed knowledge of military aviation practices that couldn't be explained by casual reading or general interest. Are your pilots receiving sufficient training in energy management and basic aerodynamics before they begin F-35 systems training? Dorothy asked. Complex technology builds on fundamental principles, and weaknesses in basic knowledge can limit effectiveness with advanced systems. The question identified another significant concern within Air Force training programs. Many pilots were advancing to sophisticated aircraft without mastering the fundamental principles that underpinned all aviation, creating exactly the kind of limitations Dorothy had observed. Captain Walsh was becoming increasingly convinced that Dorothy's knowledge reflected professional experience rather than amateur interest. Her questions were too specific and her observations too accurate to be explained by casual study or general curiosity about aviation technology. Mrs. Chen, Captain Walsh said finally, "Your insights are remarkably sophisticated for someone attending civilian outreach programs. Would you be willing to share more about your background and how you developed such extensive knowledge of aviation principles?" Dorothy's response was polite but evasive. "I've had many years to read and think about flying. Modern aircraft are fascinating examples of how technology can extend human capabilities." The deflection was skillful but unsatisfying. Dorothy clearly possessed knowledge and understanding that warranted explanation, but she seemed determined to avoid revealing the source of her expertise or the extent of her qualifications. Major Chen decided to test Dorothy's knowledge more directly by presenting specific technical challenges that only experienced aviation professionals should be able to address effectively. He described complex flight scenarios involving system failures, emergency procedures, and performance limitations that required sophisticated understanding to analyze properly. Dorothy's responses to these technical challenges were impressive and accurate. She identified appropriate solutions, suggested alternative approaches, and demonstrated understanding of the principles underlying each scenario that clearly reflected extensive practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge. "You're describing textbook solutions with the kind of practical insight that comes from actual experience," Chief Master Sergeant Kowalski observed. "Are you sure you don't have flight training or professional aviation background?" Dorothy smiled politely but continued to deflect specific questions about her qualifications. "I think good principles apply regardless of the specific technology involved. Flying has always interested me, and I enjoy learning about how different approaches can solve similar problems." Her evasiveness was becoming more obvious and more intriguing. Dorothy clearly possessed extensive knowledge and practical understanding, but she seemed determined to maintain the fiction that she was simply an interested amateur rather than someone with professional qualifications. The meeting continued through lunch, with Dorothy providing insights and suggestions that consistently impressed her military audience. Her recommendations about training methods, performance optimization, and pilot development reflected understanding that could only come from extensive professional experience in aviation education and operations. By mid-afternoon, the three Air Force officers had reached an unofficial consensus that Dorothy Chen was far more qualified than she was willing to admit. Her knowledge was too extensive, her insights too practical, and her suggestions too sophisticated to be explained by casual interest or amateur study. Captain Walsh decided to make one more direct attempt to learn about Dorothy's background. "Mrs. Chen, we've spent most of the day benefiting from your expertise and insights. Your knowledge is clearly professional level, and we would appreciate understanding how you developed such sophisticated understanding of aviation principles and pilot training." Dorothy's response revealed the first hint of frustration with the continued questioning about her background. "Captain, I'm here because you invited me to share observations about your F-35 program. If my comments are helpful, I'm pleased to contribute. If they're not useful, I'm happy to conclude our discussion." The mild rebuke was delivered politely but firmly, establishing Dorothy's boundaries while avoiding direct answers about her qualifications. Her position was reasonable, but unsatisfying for Air Force personnel, who were increasingly convinced they were dealing with someone whose expertise far exceeded her apparent civilian status. Major Chen decided to approach the question differently. Mrs. Chen, regardless of your background, your insights today have been extremely valuable. Would you be interested in observing some of our actual training operations? We think you might have useful perspectives on pilot performance and instruction effectiveness. The invitation was significant because it would provide Dorothy with access to operational training activities that were normally restricted to military personnel and official observers. Major Chen was essentially offering to treat her as a professional consultant, despite her apparent civilian status. Dorothy's acceptance was immediate and enthusiastic. I would be very interested in observing pilot training if that would be helpful. When would such observation be possible? The arrangements were made quickly. Dorothy would return the following week to observe F-35 training flights and provide commentary on pilot performance and instructional methods. The opportunity would give her unprecedented access to operational military aviation, while providing the Air Force with insights from someone whose expertise they were beginning to appreciate, despite their inability to understand its source. As the meeting concluded, Dorothy gathered her notes and prepared to depart with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her entire interaction with Edwards personnel. Her modest demeanor remained unchanged despite having spent hours demonstrating knowledge that clearly reflected extensive professional experience. Captain Walsh escorted Dorothy to the base entrance while continuing to probe gently for information about her background and qualifications. Mrs. Chen, I hope you don't mind my curiosity, but your expertise is quite remarkable. Are you sure there isn't more you could tell us about your aviation experience? Dorothy's final response was gracious, but definitive. Captain, I'm simply someone who has always been fascinated by flying and has had many years to study how it works. If my observations can be helpful to your programs, I'm pleased to contribute whatever insights I can offer. The answer was polite, humble, and completely uninformative about Dorothy's actual qualifications or experience. She had successfully maintained her civilian volunteer facade, while demonstrating knowledge that clearly indicated professional-level expertise in aviation and pilot training. As Dorothy departed Edwards Air Force Base for the second time, the three officers who had spent the day with her were left with more questions than answers. Her knowledge was undeniable, her insights were valuable, and her recommendations were sophisticated enough to warrant serious consideration by professional military aviators. But Dorothy's true identity remained a mystery that would soon be revealed in ways that none of them could anticipate. The elderly volunteer who seemed so determined to downplay her capabilities was about to demonstrate that assumptions about age, gender, and civilian status could be catastrophically misleading when applied to someone whose actual qualifications transcended every expectation. Captain Walsh returned to her office with Dorothy's business card and a growing conviction that Edwards Air Force Base had encountered someone whose presence would prove far more significant than anyone had initially realized. The stage was set for revelations that would challenge fundamental assumptions about expertise, capability, and the nature of excellence in military aviation. Dorothy's notebook contained observations that would soon prove prophetic, and her quiet suggestions about pilot training would become the foundation for changes that transformed how the Air Force approached F-35 operations. The unassuming volunteer was positioning herself to demonstrate that true expertise often came in unexpected packages, and that the most profound insights might emerge from the most unlikely sources. The following week's training observation would mark the beginning of Dorothy Chen's transformation from mysterious volunteer to recognized expert, but that transformation would come at the cost of revealing capabilities that would shock everyone who had dismissed her as just another curious retiree interested in modern military aviation. The Air Force was about to learn that excellence transcended every assumption they had made about who possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to push their most advanced aircraft to its ultimate performance limits. Dorothy Chen was preparing to demonstrate that 71 years of age represented accumulated wisdom rather than diminished capability, and that underestimating her would prove to be a mistake of historic proportions. Week by week, Dorothy was methodically dismantling every preconception about civilian limitations and age-related decline in capability. Her patient approach was building toward a demonstration that would redefine how military aviation understood the relationship between experience, expertise, and the ability to excel in the most demanding flying environments. The appointment for the following week was scheduled, the access arrangements were confirmed, and Dorothy Chen was positioned to begin the most significant phase of her remarkable interaction with Edwards Air Force Base and the F-35 Lightning II program. What happened next would transform her from an enigmatic volunteer into a legend whose capabilities would be discussed and debated throughout military aviation for decades to come. The morning Dorothy Chen returned to Edwards Air Force Base for her training observation appointment. An unexpected emergency was unfolding that would change everything. At 06:00 hours, Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell received a priority message from Air Combat Command Headquarters that would test every assumption about pilot capability and aircraft performance. "Sir, we've got a situation developing with the red flag exercise in Nevada," reported Captain Angela Stevens, bursting into Mitchell's office with classified communications equipment. 3 F-35s have encountered severe weather conditions that have pushed them beyond normal operational parameters. The pilots are struggling with manual flight controls after their automated systems malfunctioned during extreme turbulence. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell studied the incoming reports with growing concern. Red Flag was the Air Force's premier combat training exercise, designed to simulate the most challenging combat conditions pilots might face in actual warfare. The fact that F-35 pilots were having difficulty managing their aircraft during simulated combat operations represented a serious training and capability issue. "What's the current status of the aircraft and pilots?" Mitchell asked, reviewing the technical data streaming from the troubled F-35s still airborne over Nevada. Captain Stevens consulted her secure communications display before responding. "All 3 pilots are reporting loss of confidence in the aircraft's automated flight control systems. They're attempting manual flight in conditions that exceed their training experience. The weather is deteriorating, and they're burning fuel faster than planned due to inefficient manual flying techniques." The situation was exactly the kind of scenario that Dorothy Chen had identified during her recent discussions about pilot training and system dependency. The F-35 pilots were discovering that their reliance on automated systems had left them unprepared for conditions that required fundamental flying skills and aircraft control techniques. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was coordinating response options when his assistant announced that Dorothy Chen had arrived for her scheduled training observation appointment. Under normal circumstances, civilian visitors would be rescheduled during operational emergencies, but Mitchell's conversations with Captain Walsh had convinced him that Dorothy's expertise might prove valuable during exactly this kind of crisis. "Send Mrs. Chen to the operations center," Mitchell decided. "Her insights about pilot training and manual flying techniques might be relevant to what we're dealing with in Nevada." Dorothy entered the operations center wearing her characteristic practical clothing and carrying the same canvas bag that had accompanied her through previous visits to Edwards. Her demeanor remained modest and unassuming, but her attention immediately focused on the displays showing real-time data from the troubled F-35 missions. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for coming despite our current emergency situation," Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell said, approaching Dorothy with obvious urgency. We're dealing with exactly the kind of pilot training issues you identified during your recent discussions with our staff. Dorothy studied the tactical displays showing aircraft positions, weather conditions, and performance data from the 3 F-35s struggling over Nevada. Her analysis was immediate and systematic, identifying patterns and problems that reflected sophisticated understanding of both aircraft capabilities and pilot limitations. The pilots are fighting the aircraft instead of flying it, Dorothy observed after reviewing the streaming flight data. They're making control inputs that work against the F-35's aerodynamic characteristics rather than cooperating with them. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was impressed by Dorothy's rapid assessment of the situation. What would you recommend for helping these pilots regain control and confidence? Dorothy's response revealed knowledge that surprised everyone in the operations center. They need to understand energy management principles that aren't dependent on automated systems. The F-35's manual flight characteristics are actually quite predictable if pilots know how to work with them rather than against them. Captain. Stevens looked up from her communications console with an expression of disbelief. Ma'am, with respect, these are experienced pilots flying the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Manual flight techniques for the F-35 require extensive specialized training. Dorothy's reply was delivered with quiet confidence that carried unexpected authority. Captain, advanced aircraft still follow basic aerodynamic principles. If the pilots understand energy management and control harmony, they can fly the F-35 manually in conditions where the automated systems become unreliable. The assertion was extraordinary coming from an elderly civilian volunteer, but Dorothy's previous demonstrations of aviation knowledge had earned her enough credibility to warrant serious consideration. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell decided to test her claims by asking for specific guidance that could be transmitted to the struggling pilots. Mrs. Chen, if you were advising these pilots directly, what specific techniques would you recommend for improving their manual flight control in the current conditions? Dorothy moved to the tactical display and began analyzing the real-time flight data with professional precision. Her recommendations were detailed, specific, and demonstrated understanding of F-35 flight characteristics that should have been available only to experienced test pilots and specialized instructors. The lead pilot is over-controlling in the vertical plane, Dorothy explained, pointing to specific data traces on the display. He needs to reduce power by 15% and use gentle elevator inputs with longer time constants. The F-35 responds better to patient control inputs than aggressive corrections. Captain Stevens stared at Dorothy with growing amazement. Ma'am, how do you know specific power settings and control techniques for manual F-35 flight? That information isn't available in public literature. Dorothy's response was characteristically evasive but increasingly confident. The principles are universal, Captain. Every aircraft responds to the same fundamental laws of physics and aerodynamics. But her recommendations were far too specific to be explained by general principles. Dorothy was providing detailed guidance about F-35 flight characteristics that reflected intimate knowledge of the aircraft's behavior in various flight regimes and power settings. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell made a crucial decision. Mrs. Chen, would you be willing to provide direct guidance to these pilots? We can establish radio contact, and you can talk them through the techniques you're describing. Dorothy hesitated for the first time since arriving at Edwards, her modest demeanor showing signs of internal conflict. Providing direct flight instruction to military pilots would require revealing capabilities that she had carefully concealed during her previous interactions with base personnel. Colonel, I'm not sure that would be appropriate, Dorothy replied. Carefully. These pilots have extensive training and experience that far exceeds my qualifications. But the crisis was escalating. The weather conditions over Nevada were worsening, and the 3 F-35 pilots were burning fuel at unsustainable rates while struggling to maintain aircraft control in challenging manual flight conditions. "Ma'am, we need help," Captain Stevens reported from her communications position. "The pilots are requesting immediate assistance with manual flight techniques. Their fuel situation is becoming critical, and the weather is preventing normal recovery." Procedures. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell turned to Dorothy with urgent appeal. "Mrs. Chen, regardless of your background or qualifications, you've demonstrated knowledge that could save these pilots. Will you help us?" Dorothy's facade finally began to crack under the pressure of pilots in genuine danger. Her modest civilian volunteer persona was inadequate for a situation that demanded immediate application of sophisticated aviation expertise. "Colonel, if you're certain that direct guidance would be helpful, I'm willing to assist," Dorothy said, her voice carrying new authority that surprised everyone in the operations center. Captain Stevens established secure radio contact with the 3 F-35s over Nevada, while Dorothy prepared to provide flight instruction to pilots she had never met in aircraft she had never officially flown. The situation was unprecedented in military aviation, but the emergency demanded unprecedented solutions. "Viper Flight, this is Edwards Operations," Captain Stevens transmitted. "We have an aviation specialist available to provide guidance for manual flight techniques in your current conditions. Are you ready to copy instructions?" The response from Nevada was immediate and desperate. "Edwards, this is Viper Lead. We'll take advice from anyone who can help us regain control of these aircraft. Please advise." Dorothy moved to the communication station with movements that betrayed decades of experience in similar situations. When she keyed the microphone, her voice carried the unshakable confidence that military pilots learn to trust during emergencies. "Viper Flight, this is Dorothy Chen at Edwards. I'm going to talk you through manual flight techniques that will help you regain aircraft control and improve fuel efficiency. Are you ready to copy specific instructions?" The transformation was dramatic and immediate. Dorothy's modest civilian volunteer demeanor disappeared, replaced by professional authority that commanded respect even from experienced military aviators facing emergency conditions. "Copy, Dorothy Chen. We're ready." "For instructions," Viper Lead responded, though his voice carried curiosity about the civilian name providing military flight guidance. Dorothy's instructions were precise, detailed, and demonstrated intimate knowledge of F-35 flight characteristics that astounded everyone listening in the Edwards Operations Center. She guided the pilots through specific power settings, control techniques, and energy management procedures that gradually restored their confidence and aircraft control. Viper Lead, reduce power to 85% and initiate a gentle descent at 400 feet per minute, Dorothy instructed. The F-35 will stabilize more easily if you work with its natural flight characteristics rather than forcing it into specific attitudes. Within minutes, the flight data from Nevada showed dramatic improvement in aircraft control and fuel efficiency. Dorothy's guidance was transforming struggling pilots into confident aviators who were successfully managing manual flight in challenging conditions. "Edwards, this is Viper Lead," came the amazed voice from Nevada. "Your specialist's techniques are working perfectly. How does she know so much about F-35 manual flight characteristics?" Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell looked at Dorothy with newfound respect and growing curiosity about her true background. "Mrs. Chen, your knowledge is clearly professional level. Would you be willing to tell us how you develop such expertise with F-35 flight techniques?" Dorothy continued providing flight guidance while deflecting questions about her qualifications. "Colonel, we can discuss my background after we help these pilots complete their mission safely." But her evasiveness was becoming impossible to maintain. Dorothy's flight instruction was too sophisticated, and her knowledge too specific to be explained by casual study or amateur interest. She was demonstrating capabilities that required extensive professional experience with advanced military aircraft. Captain Stevens was monitoring communications while documenting Dorothy's instructions for later analysis. "Ma'am, you're providing guidance that could only come from actual F-35 flight experience. Are you a civilian contractor or former military?" "Pilot?" Dorothy's response revealed the first hint of her true identity. "Captain, I have some experience with flight testing and aircraft evaluation. My background includes work with various military aircraft programs." The admission was significant, but still incomplete. Dorothy was acknowledging professional aviation experience while avoiding specific details about her qualifications or the extent of her involvement with military aircraft development. As the crisis over Nevada continued, Dorothy's instructions became increasingly sophisticated. She guided the pilots through complex maneuvers that demonstrated mastery of F-35 capabilities that few people outside the test pilot community should possess. "Viper 2, you can improve your turning performance by using coordinated rudder inputs during manual flight," Dorothy advised. "The F-35's flight control system provides better response when you work with its integrated design rather than treating it like a conventional fighter." The guidance revealed understanding of F-35 design philosophy and flight characteristics that was available only to personnel directly involved with the aircraft's development and testing programs. Dorothy's knowledge was too detailed and too accurate to be explained by external observation or general aviation experience. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was becoming convinced that Dorothy Chen represented far more than a knowledgeable civilian volunteer. Her expertise was demonstrating capabilities that suggested direct involvement with F-35 development at the highest levels of military aviation. "Mrs. Chen," Mitchell said during a brief pause in radio communications, "your knowledge clearly indicates extensive professional experience with the F-35 program. Are you associated with Lockheed Martin or one of the government agencies involved with aircraft development?" Dorothy's deflection was becoming more difficult to maintain as her expertise became undeniable. "Colonel, I've had opportunities to observe and analyze various aircraft during my career. The F-35 is a remarkable example of modern aviation technology." But her evasiveness was transparent to experienced military officers who recognized professional competence when they encountered it. Dorothy was providing flight instruction that could only come from someone with intimate knowledge of F-35 design, testing, and operational characteristics. The situation over Nevada was resolving successfully under Dorothy's guidance. All three pilots had regained confidence in manual flight and were managing their aircraft effectively, despite challenging weather conditions and equipment malfunctions. "Edwards, this is Viper Flight," came the final transmission from Nevada. "Thanks to your specialist's guidance, we're ready to complete our mission and return to base. Please convey our appreciation to Dorothy Chen for potentially saving our lives and our aircraft." As the immediate crisis concluded, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell turned to Dorothy with obvious determination to learn her true identity and qualifications. Her performance during the emergency had demonstrated capabilities that demanded explanation and recognition. "Mrs. Chen, you've just provided flight instruction that saved 3 pilots and 3 aircraft worth over $270 million, Mitchell said seriously. "Your expertise clearly indicates professional involvement with military aviation at the highest levels. I think it's time for complete honesty about your background." Dorothy faced a decision that would determine whether she continued her modest civilian volunteer facade or acknowledged the professional credentials that her performance had made obvious to everyone present. "Colonel," Dorothy said finally, "I suppose my background has become somewhat evident. Perhaps we should discuss my qualifications and experience in a more private setting." The moment of truth had arrived. Dorothy Chen was about to reveal an identity that would shock everyone who had dismissed her as an interesting but harmless elderly volunteer with unusual aviation knowledge. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell escorted Dorothy to his private office. while Captain Stevens secured the communications equipment and prepared to document what promised to be extraordinary revelations about the woman who had just demonstrated capabilities that transcended every assumption about civilian limitations and age-related decline. The crisis had ended, but the revelation was just beginning. Dorothy Chen was about to transform from mysterious volunteer to recognized expert in ways that would redefine how Edwards Air Force Base understood excellence, expertise, and the dangerous assumptions that could lead to overlooking the most valuable resources available to military aviation. The emergency over Nevada had provided the catalyst for Dorothy's transformation, but what followed would prove that her capabilities extended far beyond crisis management to encompass knowledge and skills that would revolutionize how the Air Force approached F-35 training and operations. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell closed his office door and gestured for Dorothy to take a seat across from his desk. The woman who had just saved 3 pilots and their aircraft sat with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout her visits to Edwards, but something fundamental had changed in the way she carried herself. "Mrs. Chen," Mitchell began carefully, "I think we both know this conversation is long overdue. Your performance today demonstrated capabilities that require explanation." Dorothy removed a worn leather wallet from her canvas bag and extracted a military identification card that she placed on Mitchell's desk. The ID was faded but official, bearing her photograph and credentials that made Mitchell's eyes widen in amazement. "Colonel Dorothy Chen, United States Air Force, retired," she said quietly. "Former test pilot, former F-35 Chief Developmental Pilot, former commanding officer of the 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base." Mitchell stared at the identification in stunned silence. The elderly volunteer who had been dismissed as an interesting civilian was revealed to be one of the most accomplished test pilots in Air Force history, someone whose contributions had shaped the very aircraft and programs he had been observing as an outsider. "Ma'am, I need to apologize," Mitchell said, his voice carrying profound embarrassment. "We had no idea who you were or what you had accomplished." Dorothy's expression was understanding rather than accusatory. "Colonel, you couldn't have known. I retired 8 years ago, and I've been quite content to remain anonymous. Today's emergency made anonymity impossible." The revelation explained everything that had puzzled Edwards personnel during Dorothy's visits. Her technical knowledge, her sophisticated questions, her systematic observations, and her ability to provide expert flight instruction all reflected decades of professional experience at the highest levels of military aviation. Mitchell activated his secure phone and placed an urgent call to Base Command. "Sir, this is Mitchell. We need to convene an immediate meeting with senior staff. We've just discovered that our civilian volunteer Dorothy Chen is actually retired." Colonel Dorothy Chen, former commanding officer of the 412th Test Wing. The response was immediate and intense. Within 30 minutes, Dorothy found herself in the base commander's conference room, facing Colonel Patricia Reeves, Chief Master Sergeant Robert Thompson, and Major David Chun, all of whom had interacted with her during her volunteer visits without recognizing her true identity. "Colonel Chun," Base Commander Reeves said formally, "please accept our apologies for how you were treated during your visits. Had we known your background and qualifications, our interactions would have been very different." Dorothy's response was gracious but pointed. "Colonel Reeves, the treatment I received was exactly what any elderly civilian volunteer should expect. The problem isn't that you didn't recognize me. The problem is that you dismissed valuable knowledge based on assumptions about age and appearance." The observation cut to the heart of institutional problems that extended far beyond Dorothy's personal experience. Her treatment had revealed systematic blind spots in how the Air Force evaluated expertise and incorporated knowledge from unexpected sources. Chief Master Sergeant Thompson spoke with obvious discomfort. "Ma'am, our personnel failed to recognize the value of your contributions because they made assumptions about civilian capabilities. That's a training and leadership failure that we need to address. Dorothy nodded approvingly. Chief, the real issue is that good ideas and valuable knowledge can come from anyone, regardless of their apparent credentials or official status. Organizations that dismiss input based on superficial judgments limit their own effectiveness. Major Chen, who had spent hours with Dorothy discussing F-35 capabilities, was struggling to process the revelation. Colonel, your questions during our technical discussions were more sophisticated than what we get from most active-duty pilots. How did we miss the fact that you were the person who established many of our current procedures? Dorothy's answer revealed the depth of institutional memory loss that had occurred since her retirement. Major, institutional knowledge disappears quickly when experienced personnel leave and their contributions aren't properly documented or preserved. You've been struggling with problems that were solved years ago. The implications were staggering. Dorothy had developed training techniques, performance optimization methods, and operational procedures that could have prevented many of the issues currently plaguing F-35 operations. Her knowledge had been dismissed because it came from someone whose appearance didn't match expectations about expertise. Colonel Reeves was beginning to understand the magnitude of the opportunity that had been wasted. Colonel Chen, what would it take to recover and implement the knowledge that's been lost since your retirement? Dorothy's response was immediate and comprehensive. Colonel, I've been documenting problems and solutions during my visits. The F-35 program is struggling with issues that were resolved during the developmental phase, but weren't properly incorporated into operational training. She opened her notebook and began presenting observations that demonstrated systematic analysis of current F-35 operations compared to the standards and procedures she had established during the aircraft's testing and development. Your pilots are achieving approximately 65% of the F-35's performance potential, Dorothy explained, showing data she had compiled during her observations. The aircraft is capable of significantly better performance in all flight regimes, but current training methods don't teach pilots how to extract that capability. The presentation was devastating in its implications. The Air Force's most advanced fighter aircraft was being operated far below its designed capabilities because institutional knowledge had been lost and training programs had deteriorated since the aircraft's developmental phase. Major Chen studied Dorothy's documentation with growing amazement. Colonel, these performance improvements would revolutionize F-35 operations. Why weren't these techniques incorporated into standard training programs? Dorothy's answer revealed the bureaucratic failures that had led to the current situation. Major, when I retired, there was supposed to be a comprehensive knowledge transfer process that would preserve developmental insights and incorporate them into operational training. That process was never completed. The systematic loss of institutional knowledge was exactly the kind of problem that Dorothy had identified during her volunteer visits. Her treatment as an irrelevant civilian had prevented the Air Force from recognizing and recovering capabilities that could transform F-35 effectiveness. Chief Master Sergeant Thompson was reviewing Dorothy's recommendations with obvious concern about the training implications. Ma'am, implementing these improvements would require fundamental changes to our pilot training programs and performance evaluation standards. Dorothy nodded seriously. Chief, that's exactly what's needed. Current training produces pilots who can manage F-35 systems adequately, but can't optimize aircraft performance or adapt effectively when systems fail. The conversation continued for hours as Dorothy outlined specific improvements that could enhance F-35 operations in every area, from basic pilot training through advanced combat maneuvers. Her recommendations represented decades of experience and testing that had been lost when institutional memory failed to preserve critical knowledge. Colonel Reeves was beginning to appreciate the scope of Dorothy's potential contributions. Colonel, Chen, would you consider returning to active consultation with our F-35 program? Your knowledge could prevent the problems we encountered today and improve our overall operational effectiveness. Dorothy's response was carefully considered. Colonel, I'm willing to help, but my experience as a volunteer has shown me that institutional attitudes need to change before knowledge transfer can be effective. People have to be willing to learn from unexpected sources. The observation was accurate and challenging. Dorothy's treatment during her volunteer visits had demonstrated that the Air Force's culture was not conducive to recognizing or incorporating expertise that came from unconventional sources. What specific changes would you recommend? Colonel Reeves asked, recognizing that Dorothy's insights extended beyond technical aviation issues to encompass organizational and cultural problems. Dorothy's recommendations were comprehensive and systematic. She proposed changes to training methods, evaluation criteria, knowledge preservation procedures, and cultural attitudes that would prevent the loss of institutional expertise while encouraging innovation from all sources. The goal isn't to replace current methods with old techniques, Dorothy explained. The goal is to integrate the best approaches from all sources and create training programs that develop pilots who can excel in any conditions. Her vision was compelling and achievable. Dorothy had identified specific problems and developed practical solutions that could transform F-35 operations while establishing procedures that would prevent similar knowledge loss in the future. Within weeks, Dorothy's recommendations were being implemented throughout Air Force F-35 operations. Her training techniques were incorporated into pilot education programs. Her performance optimization methods were adopted as standard procedures, and her knowledge preservation protocols were established to prevent future institutional memory loss. The improvements were immediate and dramatic. Pilot performance increased significantly, aircraft utilization improved, and the manual flight capabilities that had been lacking during the Nevada emergency became standard competencies that all F-35 pilots were expected to master. Dorothy accepted a formal consulting position that allowed her to work directly with F-35 training programs while maintaining her preferred low profile. Her contributions were recognized through official channels, but she insisted that the real success was measured by improved pilot capabilities rather than personal recognition. 6 months after her volunteer visits, Dorothy stood on the Edwards flight line watching young pilots demonstrate the advanced techniques she had developed. Decades earlier, the F-35s were performing to their full potential under the guidance of aviators who understood both the aircraft's capabilities and their own responsibilities as pilots. Colonel Chen, Major Chen said, approaching her observation position, "The pilots are achieving performance levels that we didn't think were possible. Your training methods have transformed how we operate the F-35. Dorothy smiled with quiet satisfaction. Major, the aircraft was always capable of this performance. We just had to remember how to teach pilots to unlock that capability. The transformation extended beyond technical improvements to encompass cultural changes that would prevent future knowledge loss. The Air Force had learned to value expertise regardless of its source and to preserve institutional knowledge more effectively." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, who had been present for Dorothy's revelation, reflected on the lessons learned from her extraordinary story. "Colonel, your experience has taught us that excellence can emerge from any source and that assumptions about age or appearance can blind us to valuable resources." Dorothy's final observation captured the essence of what had been accomplished. "Colonel, the real success isn't that one elderly volunteer proved her capabilities. The real success is that you've created systems that will recognize and preserve valuable knowledge regardless of where it comes from." The story of Dorothy Chen became legend within Air Force circles, not because of her individual achievements, but because of the institutional changes her experience had inspired. Her patient dismantling of assumptions about age and civilian Status had created lasting improvements that would benefit military aviation for generations. The volunteer who had been dismissed as an interesting amateur had proven that expertise transcended every superficial judgment about capability and qualification. Her legacy lived on in every pilot who benefited from training methods that emphasized fundamental skills alongside technological competence. Dorothy returned to her quiet retirement, content in knowing that her contributions would continue improving pilot safety and aircraft performance long after her direct involvement ended. She had proven that wisdom accumulated over decades could not be dismissed based on appearances, and that true excellence demanded recognition regardless of its source. The F-35 program thrived under the enhanced training methods Dorothy had developed, producing pilots who could excel in any conditions and extract maximum performance from their advanced aircraft. Her influence extended throughout military aviation, as other programs adopted similar approaches to knowledge preservation and expertise recognition. Years later, when pilots discussed the legendary volunteer who had revolutionized F-35 training, they remembered not just her technical contributions, but the cultural transformation she had inspired. Dorothy Chen had taught the Air Force that assumptions about capability could be dangerous, and that excellence often came in unexpected packages. Her story served as a permanent reminder that institutional humility and openness to learning were essential for maintaining the highest standards of performance and safety in military aviation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.